Advisor for the Dutch Parliament, and he makes a few more words about himself. He's a relatively new acquaintance of mine. I met him at a talk where we were both giving papers at Grenoble. I think he has some fundamentally interesting things to say about information culture, and he's in the fairly original position of having worked with architects and designers before at the Berlage Institute quite recently, where the input of designers is really of fundamental importance in the way that possibilities can be exploited. And possibilities have never been more sort of fecund and profound than they are at the moment. But in order to know how to exploit them, you need to know a little bit about what information technology is and how it might be getting to structure social things, maybe economic things, certainly cultural things. So Bert's going to give us a talk which will touch on some of those and other issues also. We will have a chance to have some questions and answer scenario afterwards, so feel free to fire away towards the end of the lecture. But for now, I'd like to say hello to Bert.
Thanks. I've got to figure this out. Okay, can I walk around here? Yeah. Okay, so you heard who I am. My background is actually information technology, and the last couple of years I've been working with designers and with architects more and more, and also more and more intensely for several reasons. One of the reasons is that information technology people like architecture a lot because they use a lot of spatial metaphors. They make information spaces. They have windows on their screens. They have all kinds of cities, virtual spaces, and so as information technology grew and it became more complex and turns into social systems, they actually needed a methodology, and they thought that architecture might provide a methodology. And so they started to look towards architects. The funny thing was that when I started to work with architects 3 years ago, the architects actually didn't understand at all what we wanted. They listened to us, and then they had an attitude like, I don't really know what you want, but if you just leave me and let me do my work, I just put all the concrete in place, and then you come in with all your stuff and just do whatever you want. And then the second thing that we did was we told them that we like Christopher Alexander a lot, which was the wrong thing to say, because Christopher Alexander is actually, very, very hippie 1970s idealistic stuff, and so that put us out of the picture completely. So when we wanted to work with architects, there wasn't actually a whole lot to do. Then I was invited to do a masterclass at the Berlage Institute last summer. And what we tried to do there was something completely different. What we tried to do there is come up with a new language between information technology and media and architecture. And we called them the language of the virtual and the real. The masterclass was with Greg Lynn and Lars Spuybroek, who make these new fluid kinds of buildings, and a couple of media designers, of which I was one. And so for a couple of weeks, we tried to come up with new languages, and Lars Spuybroek and I were in one class, and we tried to develop a philosophy in which we could start with a building material that was neither immaterial nor material. So in order to just state the fact that the languages of the virtual, which is information technology, and the languages of the real, the design language of the real, which might be architecture, just state that we were actually working on a synergy. We tried to come up with a building material that was neither material nor immaterial, and then play with that. Play with what it is in classrooms anymore. And so we needed to resize the school, do all kinds of different things. And there's a current trend in education where people actually build schools around a vision that they have for the learning community, and the school actually grows from that vision. There's an architect and an educator that do that. Basic to that vision is that information technology actually provide a catalyzing environment that allows them to do so. But they were still thinking in terms of learners and teachers, and in a physical school building. And what we did is actually we pointed out that you could actually connect this network out to the network in society. And so the first network that we connected them to was the parents. Can you put the next one? And so what we did was we actually, since we projected this network, we connected teachers, learners, and parents, which is simple, but in this case the parents in Holland were Islamic people that lived in a let's say, a poor area of town. And the parents were often women, Islamic women, that didn't come out of the house so often. And so the interesting thing is that when we then teamed up the parents in the network to the learners and the teachers, we actually all of a sudden gave them a look at how their children lived in the school, which caused a completely different psychological relationship between the mothers and the children. At the same time, we started to design, or we were actually starting to design, because this is in process, we're starting to design learning material by which the children in the school learn Dutch. They can use the same material over the internet to teach their parents. So here, their pupils being taught by their teachers, and here their teachers teaching their parents. And so again, all of a sudden, when you have a school and it's a physical building, it's away from a certain community, it doesn't touch the community. When you actually embed them in the internet and design stuff in the internet that enhances the community, the learning experience isn't only a physical building, but it becomes a tool for social cohesion. Now all of a sudden the city starts to be interested, because the quality of the school is not only the building, but the quality of the school is the quality, the design that is actually embedded in their informational environment. When the design of their information system is very, very good, all of a sudden it becomes a much stronger catalyst throughout all of society than when the design of their building is all right. Then, of course, there were other partners, the government, business, and institutions in society. We went out to them and asked them to make educational material. So you would be learning about hydraulics in the school, and there's a company that actually makes a machine that uses hydraulics, and it illustrates the hydraulic principles on the latest machines. In this case, you actually make a connection between the business and the school, where the school provides the basic information and the business provides the latest technology information, but exemplifying the basic principles. The funny thing is that the school stays very, very modern, where the business actually can use the basic information provided by the school to teach the new people that live in the business. And all of a sudden, you get a connection between this business network in terms of knowledge and the school network. And of course, the business is interested by all the pupils coming by, because then they know that this business makes this kind of machine, and when they're starting to work later on, it might be profitable. The same goes for institutions like museums and newspapers. And so again, here you see that when the design of the information, the virtual school, actually is right, it becomes a much stronger catalyst all throughout society. And it becomes a tool for social cohesion, but it also becomes a tool for possibly for economic stimulation. And so what we had is we had a community of learners, but also a network of issues, because the issues around knowledge here and the issues around knowledge here were completely different. And so what we found out is that when you create a school, you create a school. But when you actually add a virtual network to the school, you create a network of contexts, because all of a sudden these businesses were tied to the school and they were starting to exchange money. And then all of a sudden, when the business was tied to the school and the museum was also tied to the school, the museum saw that they could use the software of the business. And so you could actually, by hooking up all these people virtually, you could actually create a certain kind of synergy that would far surpass the building of the school. Of course, the physical site was different because we used information technology, but the effect that the school had throughout society was a lot larger. So it's this physical virtual combination that actually enhances the power of the school. And so the catalysts here were the site, the fact that they needed to build a physical network, the fact that there is a network, the fact that we created the awareness that you could do those things, because we didn't do them by themselves, we just invited people. We just came up with the idea. We didn't need to invest any money because these institutions and businesses already were on the internet. But they just published their phone numbers. So the only thing we did was actually suggest the fact that the synergy is possible and gave them a couple of educational templates. So you inject an idea and you give people very, very simple tools, and by that you actually stimulate developments going on. Another example that is similar to this one is the University of Future Generations, which was a project that we did on a brief in Australia. They invited people to come up with proposals for a University of Future Generations that had to be based on ecological principles. And there we actually created a virtual physical university, where the university, the physical plot itself, was designed to have a couple of big buildings and then many, many, many smaller buildings. And the relationship between the physical and the virtual was that the physical university collected the people, the teachers and learners from all over the world. The fact that they came together was because they knew each other through the virtual network. It was an internet-based curriculum where the teachers could actually embed their stuff from all over the world, and learners could actually extract it from all over the world. But they would know each other as a social community by having been here for a couple of months. And then they would leave and go all over the world. The design was such that over the years the university would be smaller and smaller and smaller, but firing up a more and more intense network all over the world. And the network would actually comprise the same institutions and business and governments, but now they would be in India and Africa and America and whatever. And so here you see that based on this ecology thing, it's the same scheme between the virtual and the physical, and there are very strong relationships because the design of the virtual, the information system, actually determines the shape of the physical. Without the physical system, the virtual wouldn't have been there. Without the virtual system, the physical would have been completely different and much less effective. And so there's an interesting combination of the physical and the virtual in these real-time projects. And then, of course, there's many other things that happen in the information society in general. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you a couple of models. Can you give me the next one? I'd like to give you a couple of models and talk about networks, about dialogue, about the dynamic of the information society, and about reflection. I'm not talking about information technology at all. I'm not so very interested in information technology. I think it's basic, and I think it's going to be there. And when I think it's going to be there, I think that in the next 5 years, in countries like these, and Holland and Scandinavia and France and Germany, in the next 5 years, the internet will be a broad medium throughout society, which doesn't go for Africa, or doesn't go for India, or doesn't go for China. But for these countries, it probably happen in the next 5 years, which means that it won't be 100%, but it might be 40, 50, 60%. And it might be high bandwidth into the home. If you look at the developments of information technology, since a couple of years, the developments of information technology are actually driven by the living room and not by the offices anymore. Because the market in the homes is bigger than the market in the office. So that's why you see all of a sudden an enormous upsurge of the integration of audiovisual media and televisions. Also much nicer designs, one-button designs or whatever. Because all of a sudden the home user is much more upfront in the designs than the office user. There's a couple of technologies that come together in the next couple of years. One of them will be high bandwidth into the home. New ADSL services in the telephone network allow very, very high bandwidth into the home, which means 1.5 megabit on normal copper wiring for a price that is a couple of times ISDN, depending on which country you live. So in Holland, by the end of this year, there will be a normal product. So that means that if you have your office, you can have a 1.5 megabit service into your home for very little money per month, which means that surfing the internet becomes something completely different. Right now in Holland, for about £30 a month, you can have 24 hours access with no extra charges on the cable. Now the cable is very, very interesting because when there's nobody else using internet on the cable, it's very, very high bandwidth. Usually what happens is that if you the structure of the cabling system, the TV cable system, I don't know, what do you call it here? Is that yeah, it's coaxial, but you have an English word for cable system, or is it just cable? Okay.
Cable TV.
Cable TV, all right. So the structure of the cable TV is that there's a couple of households on the last line. And so that means that when you're a single person on this last line, and all the other people are older, or I don't know what, they don't do anything with the internet, you have a very high bandwidth link. As soon as everybody fires up their televisions and use internet, you have a very, very slow link. And so cable TV actually was a big, big promise, but now it kind of tends to be 24-hour a day access, but at very, very slow speeds in the next couple of years. All the schools will be fired up in the next couple of years. And so that means that the internet will be a broad medium in society, and probably everything will start to work with it. Which means in Holland there's a new thing they came up with, which is all the utility meters. Next to the front door you have a small cabinet which is about 30 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters thick, And it has a water meter, a gas meter, electricity meter, a telephone exchange, website, and an email site. And all the meters, all the utility meters are electronic, and they exchange all their numbers over the internet. So that means that once you enter a house, the house has internet because it needs it. And if you want to use the World Wide Web, that's your problem. But the house already has it. Other things, if you think about a broad medium in society, is that in the future people estimate that you will get your social service money, not social service, but social service money probably. Social service money over the internet. So it means you don't have any money, you're doing very, very bad. You're getting social service money from the government. The first thing you get is internet access, because otherwise you can't receive your money. And so if you think about these infrastructures that will be in place in the next 5 years, they are very, very basic, and they actually hook up everything to everything. So it's not there's a completely different dynamic than there is today to the internet. The other thing that you have to remember, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about this because it's my background. The other thing you have to remember is that once internet is on television and everybody's hooked up, it will turn into something completely different than it is right now. Because these technologies usually tend to be socially upward mobile. Like the VCR and the color television, they're accepted low in society first, and then they travel upwards. The reason that internet is actually the other way around is because computers are expensive and telecommunications costs are very expensive. But once the internet is actually basic and it's for free on every television, there will be a completely different dynamic around the internet. Completely different media. Completely different groups of people will actually cannibalize or do anything, whatever they want on the internet. And so the atmosphere will change drastically. Well, in that atmosphere, completely different things will start to happen. And so in order to predict what will happen in the next 10 years, you have to kind of get a feel. You have to be careful to just not project the situation of today in 5 to 10 years, but actually think about it. One of the things that people are very, very afraid about when they talk about information technology, not architecture, is that there will be a separation in society between those who have and those who have not. And they usually project their image that the people that are rich will have access to information, the people that are poor won't have access to information. Probably the reverse will be true. Because if you go to a factory, there are more computers on the work floor than in the office of the directors. If you now go to video gaming halls, there are more people that earn little money that use games and gaming machines than people that are very, very rich. And so you have to be careful with the dynamics of all this information technology stuff. What I'd like to do is, I'd like to just talk about these 4 networks, but with the background of a change, a transformation that takes place based on all this information technology. Okay, so networks. Everybody talks about networks. And usually people think that networks have something to do with computers being hooked up. They do actually, but very little. Of course, a computer network is computers being hooked up. The funny thing is that if you very carefully think about information technology, on any level of information technology, you see networks. So if you take a computer, for instance, this is my PDA. And this is my PDA. If you think about computer networks or computers itself, everything in computers has networks as its architecture. If you look at the CPU, the central processing unit, now you have many, many CPUs together. If you look at the memory, it's kind of a network. If you look a little bit higher, if you look at the new kinds of system software, they're object-oriented and they're networks. If you look at applications, they become components. If you look to databases, they become object-oriented and they become networks of small objects. And so if you look at users, they're hooked together and work in networks and groups and more distributed. And so that means that at any level, the technical level, the software level, the data and the information level, and the user and the community level, networks are actually the architecture when you start to deal with information. So networks, the concept of networks is much more basic than just hooking up computers. So that means that networks in the information society, and this of course is my camera, the small Canon X's. The interesting thing is that the new chipsets that are in these things are as powerful as the most powerful chips that you now have in CPUs. So it means that the developments that take place in the next 5 years will be dramatic in almost anything. Computers, for that sense, are kind of, old hat. They're personal computers, the way we know them right now, we already know and we can predict. What is much more interesting is that apart from the 600 million PCs are there, is the 6 billion chip cards that are there. And of course, the chip card manufacturers the last couple of months all signed a treaty saying that they will actually all carry Java operating system in the next year. So that means that the billions and billions of chip cards that will exist in the world will all have the same system software. And so a PC is a very dedicated thing, but it's not so interesting. The amount of software in a car doubles every year. The amount of software in a television doubles every year. The amount of software in your radio doubles every year. A cheap car has more than 20 CPUs. An expensive car has more than 80 CPUs, controlling almost everything. And all these developments will come together in the next 5 years. So heavy, high bandwidth telecommunications and all this smart stuff will come together. And it will not be without consequences. And the basic architecture is networks. From the basic hardware technology, software data, but also from communities and the re-architecting of economy and companies. And so that means that if you understand how networks work, you have one of the basic new dynamics of the information society. Which means if you understand how networks work, you also understand in which direction architecture is moving. So in networks have this distributed quality. Of course, a hierarchy is also a network because it consists of nodes and communications and relations between them. Usually networks have nodes that are more equivalent to each other and they have a distributed quality. Stuff is shared in networks. Information is shared in networks. Tools are shared in networks. But stuff is also distributed. What is distributed? Information, power, aggression, war. As soon as you move from a hierarchy to a networked environment, things tend to be distributed. So if you look what happened to the world after the wall fell between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, more than 40 different civil wars started up, which were predicted with the people from holomology, that study wars and aggressive behavior, where they said that in network societies there will be small-scale violence distributed throughout the network. Small-scale violence meaning Japanese people blowing up Japanese people and American people blowing up American people. So if you talk about networks, the dynamics of networks is not only a structural thing. If you think about the dynamics of networks, it has and the distribution of information or whatever, it also leads to the distribution of power or aggression or what. Another thing about networks is that if people are part of a network, you have to be active. You're supposed to participate in a network. So that means that if you see a development in the direction of networks, it's something completely different than a hierarchical situation comes into existence. When you live in a hierarchy and everything is very fixed and predetermined and authoritarian and static, you don't need to do anything. People just give you orders and that's it. When you live in a network, you have to kind of participate, feel all the time what's happening. You can't really tell what's happening tomorrow. Things will develop all the time. So that means that all the people have to participate. In politics, it's called interactive policy making. In economy, it's called one-to-one marketing. We went from mass marketing to one-to-one marketing. So in all these different areas, you see a breakup of very, very fixed structures where I can predict how people are going to behave, to very distributed structures where people don't really predict how I behave. And when I want to make a decision, I can't do master planning anymore. My decision is actually based on a dialogue with all the parties involved. But the parties have to participate. Because if they don't participate, I can't have a dialogue. And so when you exist in a network, when you want to create a network, for instance, in order to create a good dialogue to create master planning or to create urban planning, you have to be sure that all the nodes in the network know what the problem is about, that all the nodes have languages, that all the nodes want to participate. So if you go from a hierarchy or from a more static environment, a more static economy or a more static system to a network system, you get two opposing trends. One is that the whole system falls apart because everything becomes more individual and more assertive and stronger, and at the same time, all these things that fall apart actually fall apart just to be more dependent on each other. And so it depends on which development you focus. So if you focus on the individualization, you will actually predict that everybody will be more alienated, that everybody will go all over the place, the diversity will increase endlessly. If you focus on the dependency, you will see that people will use more standards. They will be actually tied up into systems more and more and more. There will be more and more regulation. The interesting thing is that both of these things happen at the same time. Yes, there is more regulation and there is more freedom at the same time. And so, if you understand this, that will take away, you will actually avoid losing a lot of energy, because most of the people are tied up in one of these arguments. And then predict that the other end is, the other guys are really bad. So we shouldn't have more regulation because it will kill the system. Or we shouldn't have more individualization because it will explode the system. Well, the funny thing is that when you move from a hierarchy to a network, actually the intensity in the whole system is increased. And so I need more intercoordination for more powerful units. So I'm not saying that this thing is going to go good. What these are structural descriptions of what's happening in the move from the industrial society to the information society. So in a network situation, I cannot predict what will happen tomorrow. So I don't have explicit order. Suppose we have a car factory at the beginning of this century, where everything was predictable and explicit, and I could just say to a guy to shut up and do this thing. It's very, very explicit. And when he didn't do it, I could just kick him out because somebody else was already waiting. I could precisely define what he was supposed to do. I could count it afterwards. So in hierarchies, in static systems, I have explicit order. In network societies, where everything is distributed and fast moving, I cannot predict what will happen. So order is there, but it's in the units. And when everybody's working together, intercoordinating and living together and talking to each other all the time, order is actually unfolding. And as we will see later, this unfolding is not a very, very cognitive thing, but it's much more aesthetic. And so this whole aesthetic notion is very, very important in the information society. The fact that you design your identity, the fact that you use completely different kinds of reflection in the information society than in the industrial society is very, very important. Because the people that do that are the people that you build for. And the people that do that are the people that actually live in your cities or live in your houses. And they need different houses in order to sustain this aesthetic unfolding. Because in the information society, when change actually becomes the constant, you need to constantly unfold yourself and develop your identity. There is no fixed identity anymore. I need to make myself every day. If I don't make myself every day, I'm dead. I just don't exist. So that means I need environment in which I can make myself. I need products with which I can express my identity. If the product doesn't allow me to make my identity, I'm not going to take it. So there's a I'm making a slight shift here, because now I'm not talking about the outside world, but I'm talking about the inside world. Because if the outside world is changing structure and is becoming more flexible instead of static, the inside world, my identity process, is also changing. Because the world, people work in a way that my identity is actually the result of the outside world and the way I deal with it. So if the outside world becomes incredibly complex, my processing of that also changes completely. And so that means there's going to be a new psychology. We already are confronted with it in economy because we went to one-to-one marketing, an unpredictable customer. So we talk about it every day, but we just don't realize it. But it might be so that people that are living in a house today are completely different people than 20 years ago. But the problem is, how are they different? Do they need a different house or not? So if you live in a network, you move from a hierarchical set of orders to a true dialogue. These are very, very basic models. The reason I make them so basic is because I see them everywhere in society. I work for the parliament part of the time, I work for businesses part of the time, I work in healthcare, I work in culture, and I work in education. And in all of these areas, I deal with, let's say, the new forms of these fields in the information society. So I create schools of the future. At the parliament, I do things, and in local communities, but I also work in community arts and aesthetics being used for the revitalization of society. And so it means that in all these areas I see the same thing. Hierarchy is changing as in favor of dialogue. The interesting thing is that it happens, for instance, between teachers and students, but it also happens between patients and doctors. It happens between organizations or companies and customers, and it also happens between cities and their citizens. And the last one is the hardest to predict probably, because the cities and the government is the most resistant, because it's a true bureaucracy. It's the less dynamic. But all over the world, almost all over the world, you see changes like these happening. And they're actually on a drastic scale. So for instance, the country of Costa Rica in Middle America is about 3 million people. And they were a banana republic, which meant that they had about $400 million per year exports in bananas, which is what a banana republic is about. What they did in the last 10 years is that now they have a $700 million export per year in information technology. They wired up the whole country, they put glass fiber in there, they had health clinics, they put in education, and in less than a decade, they completely changed the whole country. They just shifted it around, moving away from material goods into information goods. And so there's really strange things happen, and sometimes they happen on a drastic scale. It has a lot to do with these basic models. And so here you have somebody ordering somebody else to do something. So a doctor tells a patient, you just be healed. Here I have a patient healing himself and the doctor facilitating the process. Let me give you an example. Suppose you buy a car. It's an extensive example, but I'm just going to show you how deep these things are. Suppose you buy a car. So you go to the dealership, and then you say, well, I want to have a black car with these and these kinds of seats, and you just have all the components. You make it up, you agree on the payment, they type it in the computer, they hit return, the record goes to the factory, and they start to produce the car. That's the way it works. And in the factory, actually, the factory is so flexible. There's one of these car factories in Holland. They make 100,000 cars per year, and only 6 cars are completely identical. Now, that was actually 2 years ago. There was a Volvo car factory. Now they make 200,000 cars a year, 100,000 Volvos and 100,000 Mitsubishis. And they make them in an unpredictable order. So when you actually hit the button at the dealership, the record goes to the car factory. They lock it up in a tag. They attach the tag to one of these platforms. And if the platform moves through the production line, every time it comes close to a machine, it actually programs the machine to do what this car needs. So if it's a Volvo, it does something else than when it's a Mitsubishi. So that means that if I come to the machine that actually puts in my seats, it actually puts in my seats and not just any seat. And so it's a totally customizable production line. But the thing is, you have to hit the return button, because otherwise the factory doesn't start, which makes you a car producer. You are actually the producer of the car. So you, the customer, produce a car, because if you don't hit the button, the factory doesn't do anything. It's totally silent. If nobody pushes a button here, the factory is actually totally silent, which is completely different than before, because before car factories used to produce cars. They produced a lot of cars, they waited in a parking lot, and you could pick one up, any color, as long as it's black. But now, nothing happens in the factory unless you actually press the button. So that means it makes you a car producer. This is the basic infrastructure of the information society. Because how does that happen? Well, it happens because the car factory has a generic production infrastructure. It's a totally flexible, controllable production infrastructure, where the physical movements that deal with the production are separated from all the commands. And then, of course, I can control the commands from a large distance. So in the information society, these generic production infrastructures are highly regulated and they're highly standardized. And you see them everywhere, in education, in companies, and you will also see them in the government. So the most interesting thing is that if you buy this model, so to speak, if you believe this model about this guy producing the car, you can actually see it in banks and other companies. You can see it in education right now. The funny thing is, it's very, very hard. So that means that a customer actually composes his own product through a generic production infrastructure. So then you can say a citizen in the information society will compose his or her public order through a generic production infrastructure of the city or the local government or whatever. Because this decomposition will be a basic structural mechanism in the information society. And so that's how these models are really very, very powerful, because you can see trends appearing in all these different areas. That doesn't mean that all education will be like that, or all public government will be like that, but this is a very, very basic scheme. I don't know where in architecture this will show up, but I can assure you it will show up. And of course, flexible building in the last couple of years is kind of trendy, at least in Holland it is. The problem is that a dialogue is actually a pattern of interaction. So a dialogue between two people in an information system, a user in an information system or whatever, is actually an interaction between two systems. And you can actually interact for several different reasons. I can be in the same space, which is co-location. I can have the same kind of information, which is co-information, that's what I call it. And I can also act together, which is workgroup support, based on information or whatever, which is cooperation. In each of these cases, when I want to have an interaction, I need to have two people that participate. If somebody kind of bugs out, that's okay, but then the interaction stops. And this word responsible means that if two people actually engage in a dialogue, they each need to know what it is about, they need to share a language, and they need to share a medium. So if you go to these new notions of urban planning, in which I have extensive dialogues with groups of people in an area that slowly start to kind of together build a language in order to create a future, it's a completely different thing, because I can only do that when I create two responsible partners. So the architect or the planners have to talk the language of the people that are participating, but the participants have to be able to talk the language of the planners. And we're both learning, actually. Okay? This is something else. This is the dynamics of the information society. I talked a little bit about it. In the information society, things happen in pairs of seemingly opposite dynamics. So in the information society, things become more local and more global. They become more personal and more general. They become more and more technical and more human at the same time. They become more individual and they become more institutional. And that's because we're not favoring one of these areas, like we're not creating capitalism or we're not creating communism. We're just actually increasing intensity in the whole system. So I'm not favoring one of the scales. I'm just actually enlarging and increasing the weight on both of the scales. So the intensity in a complete system is increased. And that's why you see both of these things, but they're in balance. They might not be in the right shape. I'm just describing, let's say, the structural characteristics in the information society. So it might go the right way or it might go the wrong way. But the underlying idea is that the intensity in the whole system is increasing, and I'm not favoring one of the scales. So dichotomies, simple discussions are over. We don't have time for simple discussions. And so one of the things is that when I'm doing planning, the macro, meso, and micro level are collapsed. And they're all on top of each other. So I might have a great master plan, and it might be completely fucked up by an article in the newspaper. You know, an article in the newspaper, somebody wakes up, you know, he had a bad night, withdraws $100 million, gone master plan. Key element, whatever, it doesn't work anymore. This is the way people will try and come up with some kind of development in the next couple of years, and it's doing away completely with master planning as we knew it in the 60s and the 70s and maybe the 80s. You know more about that than I do. Okay. This is another one. There's a book called Economies of Science and Space by two sociologists, Lesh and Urey. They talk about what happens in society when things start to move really fast, like now. And what happens is that reflectivity increases. So all this stuff happens. Instead of one TV channel like in the 50s, now we have 26 TV channels. We have 8 different kinds of news on the TV. We have 6 different kinds of relationships between a man and a woman. And I have to be really careful. If a man and a woman and 2 children walk into this room, they can have many, many different relationships with each other. And so I have to be careful to assume that they're just a dad and a mom and a happy family. So what happens is that if all this change goes on, I start to reflect, I start to think about it. And Lesh and Urey say, we call that cognitive reflection. The funny thing is that this is the way we used to do things. So we freeze reality, we analyze it, and we actually say that we don't like it or we feel alienated or whatever. But Leslie and Uri say that in the 90s, something else also happens. Because at the same time, we're living more than ever before. We're making fun, we're buying all this stuff. And I don't reflect on all the different fashions that go away. I don't reflect on the fact that I can all of a sudden travel all over the world. I just use this stuff. I'm creating, I'm living, I'm whatever. And Leslie and Uri actually say that we've dealt with cognitive reflection for the last 20, 30 years, and now we have aesthetic reflection. And the difference between the two is that cognitive reflection actually freezes the world, it's analytic, it's impersonal, and it generalizes the image, it's abstract. Aesthetic reflection is in the moment. It's very, very personal. It's always situated, and it's synthesis instead of analysis. And so this is the way people live, increasingly more and more, in a fast-moving society. This is what we do when we actually don't understand it and we freeze it. There are two completely different languages. And they also lead to completely different results. Now the interesting thing is that as I work in companies and in science, but also with designers, the funny thing is that designers actually know how to design something. They know how to actually make something. And so when designers have a problem, it's actually a goal for them. They analyze the whole situation and then they make a solution. When you're not a designer, and when you don't have this power to synthesize something into a solution, you're actually an analyst. And so there's two different kinds of people right at this moment. The first people that look at reality and it's faster moving and all these changes are there, they look at the situation and they analyze it. They analyze the situation of today, which is interesting, but it's useless. But that's the only thing they can do. The funny thing with designers is that they just make a solution. They also analyze it. They analyze the dynamics and the material and the economics and whatever they need to analyze. But the analysis always serves the synthesis of the new solution. Creating a new solution is actually something different than studying the problem. And so designers, and for that case also architects, actually are able to create something that is different from today. They can see something new. It is a valid skill that you have when you went to one of these design educations, and that most of the people don't have. The interesting thing is that in the information society, this integration, which might be termed in terms of Leslie and Uri more aesthetic than analytic, this integration is actually the way to survive in the information society. So this is a basic trend that is actually coming up right now. And what you see happening right now is that, for instance, the aesthetic in society is coming back slowly. And my statement is, which is not in this presentation, but my statement is that culture will replace the economy as a structuring element in society. So that means that money is interesting, but it doesn't generate money. Stories generate money, meaning generate money, added value generates money. But money becomes less meaningful by the day. What do I mean by culture replacing economics in the information society? I mean that in urban planning, it doesn't matter if you have money or it doesn't matter if you own the land. What people want to do now is cultural programming. They make a story, and then around the story they create an area. Now, in the last 10 years, the city of Frankfurt opened 13 museums. And they opened 13 different museums just to be attractive to the people that work there. In London here, the design industry actually earns more money than the financial industry. So that means that there's, whether you look at culture as small culture, let's say music or design or whatever, or culture on a grand scale that comprises everything, you see that the meaning and the added value of things, and there's many, many different examples, meaning and added value actually become more and more powerful tools in their own right than economy. So there's a couple of reasons to assume that aesthetics actually become more important in the information society. Okay? So in a fast-moving world, there's many, many different contexts. There's a zillion kinds of music, there's a zillion kinds of fashion, there's a zillion kinds of news. And so you're in many, many different environments all at the same time. But that doesn't mean that you're reflecting. The fact that you're switching contexts every day doesn't mean that you reflect on it. And so if you want to survive in the information society, and if you want to be professional in the information society, switching from context to context to context is not enough. What you have to do is, on a higher level, order these different contexts. And so you have, every context is a pattern of distinctions. And so the problem of the information society will be that you have to order distinctions. Or, what you could also say, you have to pattern. So that means that what is very, very interesting is not that you are from a certain architectural school. Being from a certain architectural school is very, very interesting. But knowing the other 25 schools is also interesting. And you have to have both at the same time. Being from a single culture is very, very powerful, but it's not enough. You have to be from a single culture and also know all the other cultures. So that means that you have to have your single activity and a context at the same time. So if you do design something for people, because I'm constantly playing with these models and then applying them to architecture. So if I then now say that in the information society you do what you do, but always place it in a context. You do the local thing, and then you have the global context. In Helsinki, the architects call it the problem of collapsing scales. I'm designing the staircase outside, and I'm designing it with global economical developments in mind. I have the local and the global all at the same time. And they in many, many different ways. Sometimes in explicit ways, sometimes in aesthetic ways. I don't really care, but I have the local and the global always at the same time. If you design a house, how do you design a house that you enable the people that live in it to have the local and the global at the same time? If you design an extension to a town, if you design an urban area, how do you design it in such a way that you actually facilitate the people to live in such a way that the local and the global are there at the same time? I don't know. But I assume that you have to find a way to do that. I know I have to find a way to do that, but I do information systems. So the funny thing is that information systems and physical structures might be one of the solutions. I'll give you an example. This is something else I'm doing in Holland right now. I'm talking to the city of The Hague. And they have about 700,000 inhabitants. About what a city is in the information society. I found out they did a future studies, a scenario study. I mean, with all the citizens, and everybody loved it, and it's called The Hague 2025, which is okay. So they have 4 or 5, 6 scenarios, I don't know. And then when I asked them if anybody had talked about information and information technology, nobody had done so. So they talked about sewage systems, roads, economy, inhabitants, the quality of life, tourism, whatever. And nobody ever mentioned information technology and the changes it's going to bring in the next 5 to 10 years. So that means that although everybody kind of plays with that notion of the information society, it's a gray area. Everybody talks about it, nobody thinks about it. So everybody uses the right words, everybody talks about the internet and we should do something about it. Everybody talks about new media and privacy, and it's all bollocks. Because nobody thinks about it. Everybody talks about it. And then they donate money. So in the next 4 years actually, the Dutch Department of Education will donate 1 billion guilders, computers and networks, into the Dutch educational system. It's silly, because they don't know what to do with it, but you just give 1 billion guilders to kind of boot it up, and they have no clue what will happen with it. So the whole city of The Hague, actually, I was talking to them and they said, well, you know, we do all this information technology, it's going all right, but we have no idea where we're going to. We have everything under control, we don't have any big problems, you know, but it's kind of, you know, we're there, but what the hell is it? And so the problem is that they don't have a view of a city in terms of information. You can look at a city and go like, it has these kinds of economic dynamics. Large-scale companies, small-scale companies, really tiny scale, medium-scale companies. Okay, this is kind of all right, you know. I actually would like to have this and this discipline there. People can think about it. They can think about their finances, if they're all right or not. But they can think about their road system. You know, if it works or not and what they should do about it. People are not able to think in terms of information about a city. They cannot say, okay, I'm a city of 600,000 people. How many sources of information do I have in my community? What kinds of information do I need in my community? What would be the greeniness of my information infrastructure that I would need to sustain quality of life? How would I improve health using information technology? How can I increase the feeling of safety using information technology? No, information technology to them is technology, and they don't think about it. Maybe they buy it, but they don't think about it. And so when we thought about it, it might be possible to talk about communities and cities in terms of information systems. And these are the technology layer, the media and content layer, and the meaning layer, the use and the community and the people, the users. And once you start to do so, all of a sudden, many different possibilities become in view almost. They come into view because you have a different paradigm. So we're working on this thing. It's very hard for them. But I don't know of any other city in Holland that actually works on this new context of thinking about cities. The interesting thing is that the information architecture and the social networks all of a sudden become closely entwined. For instance, The Hague has the International Court of Justice, and it has all the Dutch government buildings. So they want to be an international city of law and government, which they have already a lot of international organizations. So I asked them if they were a teleport. No. Okay. So how can you be an international city if you're not a teleport? A teleport is a place where a lot of communication, high bandwidth communications come together. Which means that if you want to be an international center, a catalyst for international law and government, the time it takes from that building to send an email to this building should be the same as the time it takes to send an email from Hong Kong to this building. Because otherwise, you're disadvantaging all these people all over the globe. So if you want to be a global center, you need to be a teleport. You need to take away all the barriers for people to communicate with you. That's number one. The other thing is, if you think about content and media, do all the universities that have anything to do with legal education and with governmental systems, do they already have a subsidiary in your city? No. Well, invite them and give them free room. You give them one room each in one building, and we'll actually sign up all these 26 different signs for all the community, all the different universities that have one guy there, and we'll call it a virtual university for government and international justice. And then, what they want is they have an amazing group of young professionals in that town that deal with the international courts of justice and whatever. But young professionals these days, if they need to go to The Hague for 3 years to serve in one of these international courts, how are you going to make it so valuable for them that they're going to advise all their friends to come back? Well, you can only do that if you open up a club, if you strengthen the social network. And so the physical network and the network of knowledge and the social network actually all of a sudden become one policy area. And so you see that again, it's not information and wires, it's actually different contexts. Because of course in a flexible economy, the economy is networked. So that means that the companies become virtual, and we get what the Americans call the free agent nation. All the professionals will be freelance working for companies. So that means that if I have a community of young professionals here, and I want to facilitate them in the city of The Hague, I need to give them jobs in their home country. So I could start career services here. I could start personal mastery and personal effective courses here in order to actually give them careers back in their home country in a way that, and prepare them for new careers in a way that they couldn't be prepared in their home countries. And so you strengthen these networks and facilitate everybody that is active there. But all of a sudden, this is a completely different way of looking at a city. Because this is completely interdisciplinary. Because all of a sudden, the people that do social things need a teleport, which is highly technical, maybe economic. But there's no connection between economics and the social people at this moment. And so whether this information viewpoint, this information paradigm is just a paradigm or is a basic paradigm, I don't really care. But all of a sudden you see that when you use this thing, the people all of a sudden see all of their work in slightly different light. And the connections between these different departments in a city like this become completely different. And all of a sudden, a tiny little thing that happens here greatly increases the value of everything that happens there. And so you need to develop these things. And the reason that I said it's very hard is because there's very few people that can do that. There's very few people that can actually leave an existing language and build up a new language. But it's going to happen. Okay? This is something that we did in Helsinki. There's a suburb in Helsinki called Arabian Ranta. And one of the things I did there was the virtual part. We were thinking about extending Helsinki with a physical environment. And so we were playing with the notion that if I have a physical suburb, it's also a virtual community. So let's design that from the start. So there's a physical suburb and there's an information environment. And the people in the physical suburb would actually own the information environment. Yes? So that means that we actually create a very, very dense virtual environment. So the people would own their own high-band cabling systems. And and we would play constantly with the notion of the virtual and the real. And so we would introduce a lot of information technology there, but we would also actually give them a television studio and a radio studio, just for this community. The trick is that the television studio and the radio studio would be distributed into all the households. So there wouldn't be a physical television studio, there would be a physical radio studio, but the software in the network would actually create a virtual television studio and a virtual radio studio. Which means, and then of course it became research where Finnish Telecom actually tried to figure out what kind of system software you need to do that. But you have a VCR, you push the play button, and now if you push the play button on the VCR, it plays to your television. In the future it plays into the network. Anything. So there's a lecture hall here, and this is a neighborhood, so there's 2 cameras there, and this school always broadcasts on 5 channels. Whatever, you know. And anybody who wants to look at these 5 channels is perfectly welcome to do so. And then in the network there's a database, and you can subscribe to certain kinds of information. And all of a sudden, this community has a completely different layer that changes the meaning of living in this community. Because then we can integrate the schools. And so by spreading information here, we could spread knowledge. So that means around this school, since these lectures here are very, very interesting, I could hook up all the architects in London and have all the international people that lecture in this school and just broadcast it to all the architectural offices. And they can turn it on or off or whatever they want. Which means I could boot up the knowledge, could boot up the context of all the architects in London overnight. Not overnight, but I mean, let's say, as it happens here, by just hooking them up and giving them access to the lecture halls. Which is quite interesting for London, actually. It's also quite interesting for the school. And it depends on this network stuff. And it depends on the design that you have in the system. But it would definitely have a dramatic effect on the curriculum here. Because all of a sudden you wouldn't be talking to a very, very tiny little group of students. You would be talking to the whole architectural community of London. Whoever wants to tune in. And so that means that you're actually managing knowledge and the distribution of knowledge on 2 different levels. But the effect might be dramatic. Might be dramatic. It might also be catastrophic if you do it the wrong way. Whichever is right or wrong, we don't know. So the thing is that if you start to play with these things, I was talking to a project developer in Holland. He was building a physical environment in an older city in Holland, in the center. And he wanted to sell it to rich households. But the schools in the center of the town were too poor quality. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to put glass fiber in the house, boot up a whole series of services that had to do with the management of the area, and then connect those services to schools of a higher quality that were further away. And that was 3 years ago. I think they're starting building right now. So that means that you see a commercial project developer actually putting virtual services in the house to increase the value of the house by shortening the distance in a virtual way with high quality education in this house. And so his problem was, he could of course, it was easy for him to put in the wire, but he didn't know how to come up with all the services. What kinds of services do you then make? And who maintains them? And do you then, because then you need, all of a sudden, you need editors to maintain these services. Do they just edit for this small area or for a larger area? How do you do those things? And so all of a sudden you see that the physical housing and the virtual services, actually the virtual services were meant to increase the quality of life, or the experience of the quality of life, increasing the value of the house. And so you already see, and that was in 1996, you already see all these distinctions between the virtual and the real having very, very real consequences. So that means that if you're an architect and you see, and you are an advisor to a project planner, and in a certain area the price is such that it's almost possible to build, you have to be able to design a virtual environment. You have to have a context in which you can design added value virtual services to the house, because they possibly might increase the value of the house and might make the project valid. So you need this context. You don't need to be able to design this stuff, but you need to be able to kind of predict that it is designable and that it will add to the quality of your housing. So in the next couple of years, this whole area will be one of your areas. So even if you leave this school in the next 5 years, you will be confronted with all these new possibilities, and they will actually require from you to know about these things. So you will be designing virtual structures, and at the same time, or physical structures, and at the same time virtual structures. Just because it might be economically valid. Okay? So this is the abstract part. We're almost through. This is the abstract part. We looked at the virtual and the real a couple of times, and they're just two domains. We looked at different domains in society, economics and education and whatever, and they all start to kind of intersect. They have influences on each other. And the problem is, how do I talk about these influences, although I cannot talk about these different areas? Well, if two domains intersect, there's an edge condition. And so if you can you do the next one, Steve? Okay. If you want to see what happens, yeah, then what happens is that if this domain actually influences that domain, it just changes it. It becomes visible in this domain. I call it a pattern disruption. This educational system, for instance, does something, and it has some effect on economics. It's totally unpredictable, but it has some effect. Well, if it happens once, everybody forgets about it. You know, lucky shot. But then, if it happens recurrently, and it comes back time and time again in a similar way, it becomes a real thing. It's noticed. Yeah? And so that means that when this domain notices a recurring interruption, it actually becomes a shared concern. Because these guys are going to react, these guys are going to notice that they react, and all of a sudden, this recurring interruption, although these guys don't plan to interrupt this domain, they're just doing their own thing, but all of a sudden it happens to interrupt this thing. Maybe we designed something in here or whatever. And so all of a sudden it becomes a shared concern. And a shared concern becomes an attractor. And an attractor actually makes the other infrastructure visible to me. I might know nothing about education, but I see this educational disruption of my economics. And so that means that when it becomes visible, I adapt. And then, and there's two more, in the adaptation, all of a sudden I can talk about the patterning that takes place here. And the patterning I can talk about in terms of size, in terms of timing, and in terms of the goal of the patterning. So although I have two completely different abstract systems intersecting, I can still talk about it. Size, I mean, for instance, the amounts of money that we have. One of the students at the Berlage Institute is now working on something that a new harbor in the northern part of Chile. There's a very, very tiny village with 6,000 people, and Mitsubishi is building a $600 million harbor there, which is a humongous big thing with modern technology. And so he's trying to figure out how you can maintain the cohesion and the structure of this 6,000 people village that has been there for a long time, when all this new technology is invading this stuff and 6,000 extra people are added. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with these forces? Well, one of the things that you have to talk about is the granularity, the size of the money. Because whereas $600 million is a lot of bucks, the local farmers don't need $600 million. They need maybe $45 a month or something. Well, people that maintain $600 million cannot maintain $45 a month. Because $600 million takes a different control structure. $45 a month, something completely different. takes special people. It's much more personal. It's small scale. It takes a special bank to actually come up with loans $45 a month. And so that means that if you talk about granularity, the sizes of the system, and you want to actually stimulate a constructive dialogue, and you want to make it in such a way that each of these domains actually stays in existence, but they still have a valid dialogue, you have to do something in the middle so that they can talk to each other. One of the interesting things about the developments on the internet is that most of the developments on the internet are created by 2 or 3 people. Because they have a good idea, they hack something out, and it becomes a service. And then it becomes 5 people, and then it becomes 10 people. If you give these 2 or 3 people $5 million the first day they start, nothing is going to happen. In Holland, the Dutch telecom company actually tried to spend $1 billion in Holland to boot up the multimedia industry. Nothing happened, because they would actually buy 5 guys that had a lot of fun. They gave them some money, but their control structures to maintain this financial stuff were so strict. They had so many accountants and so many forms that these guys they weren't interested from day one. I mean, they were having fun and they were creating great products. And all this financial control was a total fuck up. They just didn't like it. They just didn't want to do it. It was a different atmosphere. So large scale and small scale is actually 2 different dynamics. So if you have 2 parties talking to each other, large project developers and small scale individual people in an area that you're trying to actually do something with in terms of urban planning, you have to find some language but also a size or whatever in the middle. The other thing is rhythm. If things go too fast, you don't see them. If things go too slow, they're so boring you don't notice them. The changes in a stone nobody sees. The changes in a tree is kind of okay, but like let's say for the whole tree you don't see. Usually when you hear me talk, most of you will kind of hear me, apart from those of you who don't hear me. But I didn't notice. And so most of you will kind of hear me, but that's because our patternings are actually closely adjusted. So once I started talking, you actually adjusted to the height of my voice, you adjusted to the distribution of the audio throughout the space, you adjusted to the size of my body, you adjusted to the movements that I make. And so while I was talking, all the consistent patterns were actually filtered in your brain. So all my movements you actually cancel out after a while. Because all my hand movements and whatever, you don't notice them anymore, you don't process them anymore. I have a monotonous voice, so I have very few inflections, but you actually strain to hear what I say, because it's kind of dark. So it means that you actually optimize all your processing to kind of understand me. So all this patterning that is going on goes on a zillion levels at the same time. So that means you adjust to the tone of my voice, you adjust your visuals to what I do, but they're not so very important. And then you adjust, for instance, to my selection of English words, you adjust to my pronunciation, and then you slowly adjust to the ideas that I actually try to convey. And they come from a different domain. And so you do all this patterning all at the same time, which is basic biological patterning, it's physical patterning, it's cognitive patterning, it's emotional patterning. And so it's all of this patterning happens at the same time. And it all has to do with size, and it all has to do with timing. It's all size and rhythm. I have to make my concepts so small that you can understand them, or I have to enlarge them so that you can see them. So sometimes I make a model, and then I make an extensive example. Why? I enlarge a small part of the model so that you actually see the intricacy of the model. Sometimes I expand something because it's too fast. I step over it, you don't see it. I just enlarge it in time. So when you do urban planning, or when you go through a design cycle with a client, you do the same thing. If the client is really stupid, subconsciously, you kind of adjust for this and actually start to explain more and help him a little bit and adjust your language. If he's very rich or he's very poor or whatever, you adjust your language. Happens all the time. And so this is what you do. But now, in the information society, now everything breaks up. This is the only thing that stays. You're constantly doing this, and there is no right solution. There is no right solution. So that means that the only thing that you're doing is adjusting all the time. You're actually interconnecting sizes and timings all at the same time. You might have very, very quick timings and very slow timings all at the same time. And so this process of timing that used to be a very, very structured and careful process is actually heating up and speeding up. And so that's why large scale and small scale is happening at the same time. It's fast and small are happening at the same time. And so it requires a different paradigm of thinking. And then the size and the timing of these things is different. And then the rhetoric, the goal of what you want to do is also different. So if you talk about urban planning with an economist, he optimizes something else than when you talk with a legal person. His language optimizes something else. His conceptual categories optimize something else. So the interesting thing is that the rhetoric in architecture is completely different than the rhetoric in information technology. I think that architects are actually particularly boring. So when architects have a heated debate about some kind of aesthetics or whatever, I go like, oh, nothing happens in my mind. And actually, most of the time, nothing ever happens in my mind when architects talk. because their arguments are so silly, they're kind of stupid, you know. Because my conceptual context is completely different. Now, on the other hand, when we start to talk and we get really heated up, the architects go like, what kind of shit is this? These guys are kind of talking about it and it's nothing. It's nothing. So when we were doing these master classes with media people and architectural people, it turned out that we were talking very heatedly about space, and we were so disinterested in each other's arguments because they were useless. And so that means that if you design a house and you talk to a client, the rhetoric in your head is completely different than the rhetoric that the client has in his head. If you do urban planning after you finish the school, you do something completely different than the people that live in the area. And one of the things that everybody's trying to do, for instance, Raoul Bunschoten and all the other people, one of the things that people are trying to do is bring all these rhetorics together in completely different and novel ways. And so the trick that we're doing in the direction of the information society is actually mashing up everything and then still come up with a valid solution, still come up with a valid thing. And the valid thing is aesthetic unfolding. Situated personal aesthetic unfolding. And so there's very, very interesting notions that have to do with languages. And so that's, yes, the other one? So that's, oh, this is, we can skip this one, you can just skip to it. Can you do the next one? So when you want to shape the dialogue between the information technology and architecture, that's the interesting thing about the dialogue between information technology and architecture. Where you actually force yourself to talk about the virtual and the real until you almost think it's useless, but still come up with some new kind of language. And the interesting thing is that information technology as well as architecture both need this stimulus. Because information technology, as I told you, is all of a sudden not making small administrative technological software, but it's making large-scale social systems. Very, very large-scale social systems. There are very few disciplines that can deal with large-scale social systems. Architecture is one. Information technology uses a lot of spatial metaphors. Architects use a lot of spatial metaphors. Are they the same? No. Do they have anything to do with each other? Maybe not. But it's very, very inspiring to actually mesh the two languages together and then see what the result is in each of the disciplines. So that's from the abstract point of view, just having two languages touch together and be in contact with each other. Of course, the other end is much more pragmatic. Of course, information technology and architecture, the virtual and the real, have a deep influence, and they're going to have a deep influence in the next couple of years. Different patterns of mobility, different houses, new shapes of houses, because information technology is possible, new shapes of schools, new shapes of offices, and whatever. So there's a very, very pragmatic thing that where information technology actually will interfere with the building that you design. And then, of course, there's the information technology on the tool level. You get new tools, which will have a dramatic effect. When Steve and I were in Grenoble, we were seeing software that could do sketching. Maybe you've seen that already. Computer software with which you can do architectural sketching. I just select a couple of volumes, I cut them up, I shape them, I tweak them or whatever, and it allows me to actually come up with a volume that is a building. And I haven't used a paper or whatever. It supports my creative, generative process. But it interferes greatly with what architects do today. Because now if an architect draws something, when he draws it, he already notices that it doesn't work. When you have, as an architect, when you draw a lot, you have the shape in your hand. When you draw it, you actually draw the space. And you're drawing it and you go like, this is not going to work, I'm going to do this. So it's in your hand, the knowledge is in your hand. When you extend it to the computer, it's not in your hand anymore. So you need to kind of interact with this stuff and build up a completely different kind of experience. I have a friend who designs high-speed trains in Germany, and he actually hates CAD because he says that when we made drawings by hand, engineering drawings, they were so complex to change that when there was some problem, we were standing around a table, we were looking very, very hard at the drawing, and we were thinking out loud for a solution. At the table, we would design the new solution because we didn't want to draw 6 different variations. And so we were talking about it and changing and talking and changing and talking and changing without any drawing, and then we were actually stabilizing the design. Then the people would go back to the drawing board and actually draw this thing out. Now they create 15 different variations. They don't think about designing anymore. Go like, well, you can try this one. You want to try, okay, we'll do all 15. They come back, and then the whole decision process, the whole design process, and the whole decision process is completely different. It's like, you know, it's knowledge of increasing variations or whatever, and slowly there's a certain tendency to go in this direction. It's completely different. And his old notion of really designing a train is completely different from what he's doing right now, or from what the younger people in his office are doing right now. So the tools, the information technology tools, completely and deeply change what you're up to. Completely and deeply change the way you relate to information. And so then, of course, there's the aesthetic and the logic. So can you backtrack one, Steve? So if you want to do planning, if you want to talk about planning in these high-speed times, this is the basic metaphor for planning. You need to kind of take into account history and the future. So you collapse scales where the history and the future is available at the same time, and you collapse the local and the global. You collapse the abstract and the concrete. And so if you want to do planning, each of these areas has to be involved. And when you look at this diagram, these are the same diagrams that people right now use in strategic thinking in information society. Where you actually, a couple of these things, let's say a couple of the dynamic forces come from history, and the constraints from let's say all the construction techniques. A part of the constraint comes out of the future. Part of the constraints come out of all the material substances and all the construction materials, and part of the constraints come out of your idea and the abstract. And so it means that if you want to do long-range planning these days, it's going to be somewhere here in the middle, where you have to find languages for all of these and a way to integrate them, which is, apart from, let's say, depending on what you're doing right now, is completely different than what people do right now. At least in information technology and organization technology or organizational theory, it's completely different from what people do right now. Here it is so that the future is just another past, you might say. Or the past is just another future. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's a good story. And the story actually catalyzes what you want to do. So the narrative quality of the stuff that you're doing here is actually catalyzing what you want to do. And then it says double level goal setting there, which is a very, very important thing in organizational theory right now, which means that you have to have a vision of the future. You have to know where the world will be in 5 years. You have to know where the world will be in 10 years, or your idea of it. But it doesn't matter what you think. The only thing you can do with it is realize your projects day by day in the direction of that vision. The vision by itself is nothing. The vision is a series of ongoing realizations in a certain direction. So a vision is not a product that you have in your mind. It's more a vector. It's more a direction. And so this double level goal setting comes from a book by Peters and Waterman that was written about excellent organizations. So this is what I wanted to say, which is more than 40 minutes. Sorry. So we can have a discussion or whatever, or beer, or I don't know what you do here in
we have a discussion in a large beer.
I didn't get to play with these things, so now I want to play with them. There's a whole load of these things. I don't know what happens.
Yeah, any questions?
No. Sometimes my presentations are, well, my projects are, but usually they're closed sites or they're groupware sites, you know, that are just for a small group of people or whatever. Oh, he was actually first.
Sorry.
Yeah?
Yeah, I've been thinking about unemployment
Mm-hmm.
and the increasing unsustainability of it by a harmful system at the moment. And I've actually been thinking of providing some sort of new infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
in order to facilitate new ways of employment, new concepts of employment.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you'd like to say about that?
The question is about unemployment and changes there's a couple of things that you can say about that. See, work will be less and less important. We used to be trained for a job. So you're here at the Architectural Association and you become architects. That's a concept that is not very valid any longer. You just go through a training, but you have no idea what you're going to do the rest of your life. I was trained as a psychologist, and then I ended up doing something with personal computers, and then I ended up being the head of the computer department of Holland's largest broadcasting organization, and now I'm in the parliament. My mother loves it, of course, you know, being that I work for the parliament, but I could never have predicted it. And I have no idea what I'm going to do next year, no idea whatsoever. And so that means that the connection between a formal education and the work that you do will be loosened up in the next couple of years. So the functional role of education for work will actually disappear. Since the world is changing so fast, you have to learn all the time. And so there will be a connection between learning and work, but not the functional learning that we do today. If you talk about employment and unemployment, learning is very important for everybody. So if you want to actually increase the employability of people, you have to create facilities or infrastructures that allow them or that make it possible for them to learn on a continuous basis. That's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, if you talk about unemployment, unemployment is a great thing. It's actually perfect. The thing is that we've been striving to be very, very effective. And we're now so effective that with very few people we can sustain a reasonable infrastructure. In Holland it's so now that 20% of the population actually work. The prediction is that with 5% of the people we can sustain all this material culture. Because when I was talking about the car factory, of course there's only a couple of people working there. All the carton board factories, there's 7 carton board factories in Holland, and there's more. Holland is about 15 million people, so it's about a quarter of the size of England. So 15 million people you can sustain with 7 carton board factories. A carton board factory is about a street 700 meters long, and it's maintained by 24 people, 24 hours a day, and that's it. So the expectation in the future is that material culture, the material infrastructure, can be sustained by 5% of the people. So unemployment is a concept of the past. So it's not so bad that you don't have formal work. The problem, of course, is that if people don't have formal work, they don't know what to do. They die. They hate it. And so if you talk about unemployment and employability, the notion of this formal connection with a company in a certain legal structure for a certain amount of money is very, very constricting. And there's currently new developments are taking place. One of them is that people that are very professional and they're very successful, they start to work for themselves. In America, as I said just before, there's a magazine called Fast Company that deals with all these developments. They called it the free agent nation. People work in companies, they're very, very successful, and after a while they go like, why would I work for this company? They just go home, start up in their attic. They don't start up a network, they don't start up a new company, they just work from their home. And they love it because they're completely free. So the people that can work and that are knowledgeable start to kind of work on their own. The people that cannot work, you have to take care of. It's care for the weak and manage the strong. And so you have to find other ways in which people can either learn and be employed, or you have to find different infrastructure for employment, different kinds of work. One of the possibilities might be different kinds of economy. So the formal economy that we now have with a tax system and formal wages and whatever is going to be supplanted by local exchange trading systems. It's let's communities that you have here all over England and in Canada and all over the Western world. Well, the current expectation is that the economy of the future will be consisting of 3 layers. Very, very high volume international money flows, which you read about in the paper. Then the national economy that we're moving in and out of all the time, and local economies with their own money kinds, with their own kinds of money. And they're called, right now they're called local exchange trading systems. Local exchange trading systems are groups of 100 or 150 or 200 or 300 people that actually have a bartering economy, but they come up with their own kind of money. It's very, very small scale. Any school could do that. Any group of friends could do that. Well, in Holland it is so that if you're on the socials, the payments of the social security, social services, you're not allowed to do formal work, but you can do informal work. And so that you're not allowed to earn normal money, but you can earn funny money. And so that means that this funny money stuff all of a sudden is from being a very hippie kind of 60s kind of thing, all of a sudden becomes a tool for people to do valid work, but not earn normal money. And so you can still maintain your dignity, you can still maintain your psychological infrastructure, your psychological identity, build it up, have valid exchanges, but in a funny money economy. And so there's these, so if you talk about employability, and then of course there's this whole notion that I didn't talk about, and that is the whole thing that drives the information society is the fact that I can maintain my own identity and give meaning. So the problem is that I have to find meaningful pastime. I have to find a meaningful way to spend time, whether it be work, formal work, or informal work. And so what you see right now is that all these things are actually coming together, and there's going to be a re-evaluation of work in social terms. There's possibly new economies, because these small-scale local exchange trading systems I might support by information technology, and all of a sudden I can have 25 people all over the world exchanging architectural designs. Because you can still design, although you have no formal money. So you can still maintain your professional identity, you can still prove that you're very, very good. You can still actually be involved in designs or whatever, even if you don't get any money. But you are then still dynamically tied up in all these architectural networks. If you don't do so, you're a dropout and you're going to move somewhere else. So there's very, very many different things that you can do about it. And most of the things that I'm talking about right now is in Western economies. So the situation is completely different in other kinds of economies. In India or in Africa or in China or in South America even or whatever. And there these local exchange trading systems become even more interesting. Because there the formal economies tend to disrupt the social structure. And when you can give people a new instrument where they can maintain their social structure and still have valid exchanges, that's an interesting thing. And you will see that in the next 5 to 10 years, all these things will boom all at the same time. So these are things that have been going on for the last 20 years. But now, since they get tools and all of a sudden they become large scale, and you can sustain them in a structured way using information technology, all of a sudden they become valid systems. There's a lot of research, there's research being done on funny money systems. Time dollars, ROCs, Let's dollars, you can look it up on the internet. No, it's not called funny money. I call it funny money. I call it funny money.
I mean, essentially, especially with what you're talking about work and employment and money and stuff, it seems as though work and money as a commodity or as a controller is being replaced by information and what information can allow you to do.
Yes.
So the information itself replaces the money, replaces, you know what I mean? It becomes a commodity itself because it depends on how, as it were, how intricate or how close you are to it. That defines your strata in society, in relationship to society. So rather than I don't know if there's any difference, because in the way money does what information does now, I mean, stock markets and the way money is transferred, the technology with money is such that money doesn't actually exist physically anymore at present. So if you actually it's almost like designing what money is, the information or the technology of the information is just, you know what I mean? It becomes actual money.
Yeah, but information, The fact that information is virtual also makes it a different beast than money. So if I give you a pound, I don't have it and you have it, which is a very distinct situation. Like your pound is distinct from my pound. If I give you an idea, we both have it. Actually, sharing my idea with you might make us both more creative. And so whereas money tends to be a system that is very discursive, so to speak, very distinct, information has a completely different dynamics. And maybe also, many people see information as a product, as something that you make, then it's there, and then you can sell it. Information is not a product, information is a process. So you are all in the room, I tell you a story, I don't know, it's maybe 30 people or something. Of course I tell 30 different stories. You know? I have no hope whatsoever that what I tell you actually enters your mind or is left in your mind is the way I wanted it to be. You know, it's just I just create 30 different new fairy tales. And so with information is a process. So that means that once I have information, if somebody reads it, he actually recreates it. He places this information in his own context. And so in that sense, the dynamics of information are different. And so some people call the internet, just to give you two other examples, some people call the internet economy the attention economy. There's so much information, I buy your attention, which is one way of looking at it. The other way is that you, instead of focusing on information, you could also focus on added value or meaning. You know, there's a perfectly normal person might be great in telling stories. Very, very existential stories that I would actually be perfectly happy to listen to. So it's an interest. I understand what you're trying to say, but I don't know if information can be, the metaphor of money and inflation and power and all that stuff can be one-on-one actually applied to information. Partly it could. The interesting thing about power in networks is that it's not so interesting for me to withhold information from you, because it's not so interesting for a company, for instance, these days to withhold information from a customer. Company does something wrong and they don't tell anybody. It becomes an increasingly high risk to do that. Because once people find out, you will be discredited for a long time. Now, the fact that you're discredited is a far more powerful effect than the fact that you have more money or less money or whatever. So it works. It has a different dynamic. But as I said, all these stories are just structural descriptions of what is changing. It doesn't mean that, let's say, the stuff that you're saying, the distribution of power or who has power or what or is on the right way. These are structural, almost systems theoretical constructions that we could apply wrongly or rightly. And if you look at the Wired magazine of last August, the yellow one, where there's an article of the long boom, they describe part of these trends, but they also describe the vicious cycle and the virtual cycle, where the vicious cycle is when you actually don't participate. You close and you go into a power game. We could do so. We could